When a routine traffic stop becomes a pivotal moment in an officer's career, his worst assumptions clash with a reality he never anticipated. The man he targets holds the key to his future. As the sun dipped over Sacramento, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Eric Porter drove home after a long day at work. His sedan purred quietly, the air conditioning on, as he tried to shed the stress of the day. The faint sound of the radio played in the background, a soothing counterpoint to the hum of city life. Approaching a yellow light, Eric slowed down, stopping just as it turned red. That's when flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror, followed by the piercing wail of a siren. He furrowed his brow slightly, pulling over to the roadside. Lowering his window, he watched as a police cruiser parked behind him. Officer Bradley Larson stepped out, mid-30s, buzz cut, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. Adjusting his belt, he walked toward Eric's car with the air of someone accustomed to authority. "License and registration," Larson said curtly, his tone flat but authoritative. Eric nodded calmly, retrieving his documents from the glove compartment. He handed them over without a word, all while feeling Larson's scrutinizing gaze, searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson leaned in closer. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied, polite yet firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned but nodded. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Eric more intently. It was no longer a simple traffic stop. Larson's posture shifted subtly, signaling he believed there was more to this encounter. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson asked, glancing at the license in his hand. Eric hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't listening. His questions grew sharper, his tone implying suspicion. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Eric replied steadily, though the air between them had shifted. Larson wasn't looking at him as just another driver anymore. Eric could feel the tension, but his composure remained intact, a quiet strength that Larson couldn't ignore. Larson stepped back, folding Eric's documents deliberately before tucking them into his chest pocket. He stood straighter, a faintly smug expression crossing his face. "Step out of the car for me," he ordered. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face betrayed no emotion. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked evenly. Larson's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Exhaling slowly, Eric opened the door and stepped out. Larson's eyes swept over him, sizing him up. Eric was taller, his tailored suit exuding professionalism, his polished shoes speaking of meticulous care. None of it seemed to matter. "Hands where I can see them," Larson instructed. Eric complied, his movements deliberate and calm. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Eric asked. "Just routine," Larson replied with a faint smirk. "We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful." "Incidents involving men in suits driving sedans? Or does this have to do with something else?" Eric's question was pointed, landing like a punch. For a moment, Larson's composure faltered. His hand drifted toward his belt, a reflex more than a necessity. "Watch your tone," Larson said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Eric replied. His voice held no defiance, only quiet firmness that seemed to unsettle the officer. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works." Larson leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You hiding something?" Eric let the silence stretch before responding. "No, officer. I just believed in being clear about the reasons." "Transparency, you know," Eric said evenly. Larson scoffed but didn't respond. He stepped back, pacing a tight circle near the car. The dynamic was shifting, though he couldn't quite put his finger on how. Eric wasn't reacting the way most people did. No fear, no stammering, no nervous gestures. Instead, there was an unsettling calm, controlled, composed, that made Larson uneasy. "You're pretty confident," Larson muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you already know how this is going to end." Eric didn't take the bait. Tilting his head slightly, he replied, "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze for a fraction of a second, his expression sharpening into something defensive. He turned back to face Eric, starting to speak, but the words faltered. The man's unwavering composure was throwing him off, and he hated it. The silence stretched, taut and charged, as Larson began to realize this wasn't going to go the way he'd expected. But instead of stepping back, he doubled down. His fingers tapped against the holster on his belt, frustration simmering just below the surface. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Eric. His gaze flicked toward the sedan, as if searching for some reason, some justification he hadn't yet found. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, incredulous but measured. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw tightened, his composure cracking for the briefest moment. "I'm not going to ask again." Eric hesitated, a fleeting, unreadable expression crossing his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his hands flat on the hood of the car. The crunch of Larson's boots on the asphalt filled the tense silence as he approached. The pat-down was brisk, rough, his hands lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was a power play, an attempt to provoke. But Eric didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't react in any way. He remained as composed as ever. "You're clean," Larson muttered begrudgingly as he stepped back, the admission laced with irritation. It was clear he'd wanted to find something, anything, to validate his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, his expression steady, his gaze sharp. "Of course I am. Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Larson snapped, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to regain control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric crossed his arms, his posture relaxed despite the crackling tension. "I've had my share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean? You a lawyer or something?" Eric smiled faintly. "Or something." The vague answer irritated Larson further. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric met his gaze without flinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believed in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. Larson took the bait, his frustration spilling over. "Fairness? You think this is about fairness? People like you always," he stopped himself abruptly, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. Eric's expression remained calm, but the subtle shift in his posture made it clear he'd caught what wasn't said. "People like me," he repeated softly, his tone calm but charged with meaning. Larson stiffened, stepping back as though realizing he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean," he muttered, his tone lacking the force it had moments before. "I think I do," Eric replied quietly. His calmness was no longer passive, it was sharp and precise, cutting through the facade like a blade. "And I think we both know," Eric said, his tone steady, "this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, unsure of how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted, and it was clear Larson was no longer on solid ground. Yet, the real reckoning was still ahead, one he wouldn't soon forget. Eric broke the silence, his voice unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows furrowed, irritation flickering back. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, though a slight crack in his tone suggested otherwise. Eric moved deliberately, his hand reaching into his pocket. "I'm retrieving my badge," he said calmly, his eyes on Larson, watching the officer's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I just want you to see it." The tension thickened as Larson's gaze followed Eric's hand. Slowly, Eric pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a badge that gleamed in the dim light. "Eric Porter," he said with quiet authority, as though introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze, his eyes darting between the badge and Eric's face, searching for any sign that this might be a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only calm authority, laced with a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Larson repeated, his voice faltering. "Yes," Eric cut in, sparing him the effort of finishing. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that those who wear this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." The color drained from Larson's face, his confident demeanor unraveling moment by moment. He took an instinctive step back, his hand falling away from his belt as though the weight of his authority had suddenly grown unbearable. Eric stepped forward, closing the space Larson had retreated from. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" he asked, his tone calm but piercing. Larson didn't respond. He looked like a man who had just realized he was sinking into quicksand with no escape. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued. "Though that's bad enough. It's not the unnecessary escalation either. It's the fact that you did all of this without even realizing who you were dealing with. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold." "And why?" Larson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eric's gaze bore into him, unwavering. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," Eric finished for him. His words weren't loud or angry, but they carried the weight of judgment. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for every person you encounter while wearing that uniform." Larson's shoulders sagged slightly as Eric's words sank in, hitting their mark. His gaze flicked down to the badge in Eric's hand, as if hoping it might vanish if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving him a moment to recover, but his voice remained firm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson hesitated, his lips parting as though to push back, but the hesitation cost him. Eric's voice dropped slightly, laced with finality. "You're also going to hear from me again. Not as a driver you stopped on the roadside, but as the man who will determine if you're fit to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard, his face reddening under the weight of Eric's words. Finally, he reached into his chest pocket, retrieved Eric's license and registration, and handed them over with trembling hands. Eric took them without comment, slipping them into his wallet. He stepped toward his car door, pausing with one hand on the handle. Turning back, he met Larson's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said, his voice low but firm. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." Sliding into his car, Eric started the engine, leaving Larson standing in the fading light, his confidence shaken and his future uncertain. But for Eric, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. His next move would ripple through the department, challenging a system that had allowed officers like Larson to operate unchecked. As Eric drove home, the silence in the car contrasted with the storm brewing in his mind. This encounter stood out not because it was unusual, but because it wasn't. Larson was just another in a long line of officers who misused their authority. The difference this time was that Eric had the power to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office in the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file lay open in front of him, Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings, none of them had ever been properly addressed. Eric leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, reflecting on the broader implications. Larson wasn't an outlier, he was a symptom of a deeper issue. And Eric wasn't interested in superficial fixes for systemic problems. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, entered holding a stack of reports. "Good morning, Mr. Porter. Here's the summary of last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon? There's something I need to go over with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course," she replied before leaving the room. Eric turned back to Larson's file, but his focus extended beyond the officer. This wasn't just about one man or one interaction. It was about the culture that enabled behavior like Larson's, the culture that gave him the confidence to believe he was justified. Eric knew one thing for certain: culture started at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned officer with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening closely as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have dismissed it as just another bad encounter," Eric said, his voice steady but firm. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It reflects how much work we still need to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it quietly, internally." "And that's the problem," Eric replied. "Quiet doesn't solve anything. Quiet lets it continue. It's time to be loud." Daniels studied him, the weight of the conversation visible in his expression. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, protocols, and accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to higher standards, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "You know this is going to ruffle some feathers." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, gathering data, talking to officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a tipping point, forcing the department to face its flaws head-on. Larson, meanwhile, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no effort to hide his involvement, sitting across from Larson as the proceedings unfolded. He watched as the officer squirmed under scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but for Eric, the real victory wasn't in disciplining Larson, it was in preventing another like him. Months later, Eric stood at the podium at a community event, addressing a crowd of officers, city officials, and local residents. He didn't focus on blame, but on shared responsibility to build a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability, they were a commitment to change. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about ensuring that those sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge we're building together." The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, he scanned the crowd. Some faces were skeptical, others hopeful, but all were listening. Eric knew change wouldn't happen overnight. But it would happen. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spark the conversations that matter, the ones that drive change. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what's possible when we stand for what's right.